Hello, and a very warm welcome to a packed out webinar today. Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting Scotland the Big Picture's first ever webinar. We've held conferences in the past and presentations, but this is our very first live digital show. My name is Alan Hepburn. I'm one of the trustees of Scotland the Big Picture. I have a number of roles, including working with our wonderful Scotland the Big Picture young rewilders, who I believe are tuned into this presentation today as well. So a very warm welcome to them too. Scotland the Big Picture, for those of you who don't know so much about us, we are advocates for rewilding as a positive and progressive pathway to breathe new life into our damaged and degraded ecosystems. We were the first organisation in Scotland wholly dedicated to rewilding advocacy and communications. Habitat restoration and species reintroduction, such as the animal we're going to hear about today, are often thought of as the cornerstones of rewilding. But what is also key and must be key is that rewilding is about people, it's about place, identity, landscape, history, community. It's about the people who have lived and worked these landscapes for generations. It's about what communities want these landscapes to look like for future generations too. Before I move on, just a little bit of housekeeping. This is a virtual presentation, so unlike a physical one, I don't necessarily need to tell you where the exits are and the toilets. Well, at least I hope I don't. But I would like to just point out we're using Zoom today. We're not using the chat function, but we will be using the Q&A function. So as questions arise in your head throughout the presentation, you can add them to the Q&A section. You can also like questions that you see there, and that kind of bumps them up the list a little bit. And what we'll try and do is answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation today. Now, on to today's topic, lynx. It's fair to say there's been a lot of talk about the return of lynx to Scotland and to Britain more widely, and also against a backdrop of climate and biodiversity emergency. Perhaps we could consider a community-led reintroduction, not only of an individual species, but also the missing ecological processes that it enables. However, to begin that conversation in a measured and balanced way, and with the benefit of knowledge and understanding, we need to explore what it would actually mean to live alongside lynx. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. David Hetherington, live from the Cairngorms, who is the author of The Lynx and Us, this stunning book, which has breathtaking images from Laurent Geslin. The book is an exploration of the Eurasian lynx and its relationship to people. Let me just give you a little bit of Dr. David Hetherington. Dave is an ecologist who lives at Cairngorms National Park. He completed his doctorate at Aberdeen in 2005 on the feasibility of reintroducing the Eurasian lynx to Scotland, and has published several peer-reviewed papers on the subject. He's travelled widely across Europe, visiting lynx-inhabited landscapes, where he met with local lynx biologists and accompanied them on their fieldwork. In Scotland, he helped set up and then manage the Cairngorms Wildcat project, which worked with the local communities and land managers to conserve the UK's only remaining wild felid. In addition to cats, his work these days focuses on the expansion of woodland habitats in the Cairngorms and elsewhere in the Highlands. So please do remember to use the Q&A function as we go through today's presentation. But with no further ado, please let me introduce and welcome Dr. David Hetherington.
Thanks, Alan. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to be able to talk to so many of you today about a species that we're, I guess, becoming slowly but surely more familiar with. We're certainly having a growing national discussion about the reintroduction of lynx, both in Scotland and in the UK as a whole. But what I'm noticing, I suppose, is that quite understandably, not everybody has an in-depth knowledge about this species. It's an animal that hasn't lived in our landscapes for many years. And even in countries that still do have lynx today, the level of understanding and awareness amongst people in those countries isn't always terribly high either. And of course, what people tend to do when they've got gaps in their knowledge is they make assumptions. And I'm seeing that, I think, increasingly, especially on things like social media. People describe how they assume a lynx behaves, how it interacts with other wildlife species, how it interacts with us. And invariably, what they end up describing, actually, is a wolf. So lynx and wolves, of course, are quite different species, and I think it is important that we understand exactly how a lynx lives and how it interacts with us, human beings. So, as Alan said in his introduction there, I did my PhD a number of years ago at the University of Aberdeen, exploring the feasibility of lynx reintroduction in Scotland, and have travelled around a fair bit around Europe and given lots of talks and things like that. And most recently worked with the photographer Laurent Gélin on this rather splendid book here called The Lynx and Us. Laurent here is the larger of the two chaps in the photograph. He's a very talented photographer. I would say he's got the best portfolio of wild lynx images available, and he's particularly good, in fact annoyingly good, at taking photographs of what is Europe's most enigmatic large carnivore on camera traps, far better than I would ever do. So first of all, before I really explore the relationship between lynx and people and what the implications might be for Scotland, I really want to talk first of all about the lynx and its ecology. What is a lynx and how does it live? So this is a Eurasian lynx. It's one of 4 species of lynx found throughout the world. There are 2 in North America. There's the bobcat and there's the Canada lynx. And then over here on this side of the Atlantic, we have the Iberian lynx of Spain and Portugal, and the Eurasian lynx, which is found right across Europe and the northern parts of Asia. And they're basically all pretty similar in that they've got the same basic lynx body plan. They're quite leggy animals. They've got quite furry faces. They've got the very typical tufted ears and that diagnostic short stubby tail. But that's kind of where the similarities between this species and the other 3 end. The other 3 are relatively small animals. They're sort of 10 to 15 kilos maximum, and they tend to feed on smaller prey, especially rabbits, hares, and in some cases birds. The Eurasian lynx, on the other hand, is a big game hunter. It's a much bigger animal. It's coming in at about 20 to 25 kilos, and it's much more interested in things like this, a roe deer. The roe deer is the ideal size of prey for a lynx. It's about the same sort of weight as a lynx, 20 to 25 kilos. So it's not so big that it can't be overpowered or that there's a serious risk of injury. However, lynx are capable of taking bigger animals. So in some parts of Central Europe, they hunt quite routinely on chamois, which are a bit bigger than roe deer. And in the northern parts of Europe, they will take semi-domesticated reindeer. But even red deer, particularly red deer hinds, are vulnerable to lynx predation. We see this in places like Poland, where red deer are much larger than they typically are here in Scotland. It is worth saying, however, that red deer stags tend not to be taken by lynx. They're too large and too well armed with their antlers to be overwhelmed. But yeah, like I say, they can take the hinds and they certainly can take the calves as well. Now, it's really important to understand how lynx hunt. Because they're not like a wolf or a cheetah, they're not a coursing predator, which means they don't chase after their prey like a wolf. They typically can chase after the prey over long distances. They've got tremendous stamina. They can chase a herd of animals and select the weakest and slowest and prey on that. And of course, as we know, cheetahs have got a tremendous burst of speed and can hunt animals down very quickly. Lynx don't do that. That's not how they operate. They're an ambush hunter instead. So they need to stick to cover. They need to get close enough to launch a surprise attack, and the whole thing needs to be over in a matter of meters and a matter of seconds. And given that it likes things like roe deer, which are typically hanging around in wooded environments, and given that woodland has an awful lot of cover, such as standing timber and fallen timber and shrubs and rocks, then wooded landscapes are really important for Eurasian lynx. That is the type of habitat that they really like to be in. But they need an awful lot of it. And that's something that I think it's very easy for us to underestimate, is just how much space one lynx, and therefore how much space a lynx population needs. We're used to thinking of smaller predators in this country, such as pine martens and foxes and wildcats. Lynx have got much larger spatial requirements. They need much bigger areas than those animals. So, lynx are territorial, they're solitary animals. They won't tolerate other lynx within their home range. So that home range is huge. It can be an order of magnitude, probably even 2 orders of magnitude greater than the animals that we're used to living alongside these days, like foxes and pine martens and wildcats. And the size of the territory, and therefore the sort of density of lynx in the landscape, is determined by 2 main things. One is gender. Male lynx have got bigger home ranges than female home ranges, but the other key driver of home range size is the amount of prey in the landscape. If the lynx is living in a landscape with lots of prey, it can get everything it needs from a relatively tight area. If it's living somewhere like northern Scandinavia, where there's less solar energy, therefore less vegetative growth, fewer herbivores, then the lynx needs a much larger home range to be able to extract what it needs from the landscape. So we find in some parts of northern Europe, and particularly northern Scandinavia, that home ranges can be 1,000 square kilometers. They can be really massive areas. As we go further south into places like Switzerland, where you've got more vegetative growth and more deer, home ranges can be a lot smaller, but still, nevertheless, huge. So 100 square kilometers for a female and 200 square kilometers for a male. So, like I say, much, much bigger than the smaller predators, which might only have home ranges of 2, 3, 4 square kilometers. So, how, of course, do they then find each other in this landscape when they're kind of rattling around, solitary animals, and they're so widely spaced apart? Well, of course, this photograph might give you some idea. They're using a variety of senses to communicate with one another. One, of course, is the sense of smell. They're scent marking around the boundaries of their territories to alert, if you're a male lynx, to let other males know, hey, this is my bit, stay out. But equally to alert other members of your species, but from the other gender, that you're perhaps available for mating. And the other thing that female lynx do is that they loudly yowl at night in the late winter time in a still, crisp winter's evening, and that sound can travel quite some distance, and that's to let the male lynx know that they're available for mating. So that is one way of them finding each other. And typically the mating season is in late winter, and the gestation period will be for a couple of months. So they're giving birth in the springtime. The females will do this completely alone. They're not interested in the males after mating, and the females will go and give birth in somewhere like a cave or a rock fissure like this, somewhere fairly secure. The mothers will typically give birth to 2 or 3 kittens. And they will stay in that what's known as a natal den for the first few weeks of their lives. But after a while, the mother needs to be able to move around the home range because she doesn't want the deer in one particular part of the home range to get too used to her presence. So she needs to move them around so that she can continue to hunt successfully. So she'll start moving the kittens into other den sites. And of course, for the first part of their life, they're living on their mother's milk, but eventually she'll wean them onto meat. And then after that, they'll start following their mother around the landscape and learning and watching her and learning how to hunt. By the time they get to 10 months old, she comes back into season again and she's ready to mate. And she effectively forces the lynx out, the young lynx out. So they have to go and make their own way in the world in what's a rather awkward in-between stage of their lives when they're no longer juveniles, they're no longer kittens, but they're not quite adult either. They're known as sub-adults. And what they've got to try and do is, well, survive, basically, and then, but also, of course, settle down and find their own unoccupied home range. And that's a very difficult time of life for them. They've got to negotiate a lot of dangers. They're half the size of an adult lynx at this point, so they need to be able to pull down roe deer, for example, successfully in order to feed themselves. They need to disperse, typically long distances, to find an unoccupied home range. So that could take them really quite some time to do that. And all the while they're negotiating really busy roads or railway lines, dogs, humans, aggressive and territorial lynx. But if they can do all that, if they can survive and settle down, then they will settle down and make their own home range and become sexually mature. And then, of course, the whole cycle begins again. So that's lynx ecology in a nutshell. what I want to do now is explore this very important relationship between lynx and people. Now, this is an image from a 14th century book about hunting, and as you can probably suggest from this image, it probably wasn't terribly happy for lynx for most of this time, this relationship between the lynx and us. Here we've got nobility and their staff hunting lynx for fun. But of course, we would have been hunting lynx for a very, very long time, much longer ago than this image. We'd have been hunting them for their fur. Their winter fur is very warm and luxuriant fur. We'd have definitely seen that as a valuable resource, and we wouldn't have wasted the meat. We'd have undoubtedly been eating the meat as well. So we were hunting them for fur, for meat, for fun, and we would have been persecuting them as a pest, a predator, one that was capable of taking our livestock. And remember, this was subsistence farming for much of human history, when we really needed those livestock to survive. And of course, we're competing with them, or at least some people were competing with them, for wild deer. We wanted to hunt the wild deer. The lynx were therefore seen as something of a pest. So it was pretty bad news for much of the time throughout human existence with lynx. And hopefully what you can see here from 3 different shades of green, we have a contraction of the lynx range in Europe over the centuries. Combined, the pale, mid and dark green show the natural distribution of the Eurasian lynx in Europe since the Ice Age. And as you can see, it would have covered the northern parts of the Iberian Peninsula, the British Isles, right across continental Europe and Scandinavia into Russia, and from there all the way across Russia to the Pacific coast. However, as human populations started to grow and our technology started to improve and our ability to manipulate the landscape and manipulate wildlife populations improved, we really started to have an impact. By the time we get to 1850, lynx are only found in the mid and dark green areas. So they've been wiped out from the British Isles and much of northwestern Europe, and they're only really found in these thinly populated and mountainous areas, such as the Alps and the Massif Central in France and the Pyrenees, and some other mountain ranges in Central Europe, but of course also the big forest and mountain complexes of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. But during the 19th century, we got really good at killing animals. There were more of us. We were using guns and traps and poisons. So from the position in the 1800 of the mid-green, we then contract down to 1950 to the dark green. So they've been wiped out from Western and Central Europe, and they're only found in the kind of remote parts of northern Scandinavia and the huge mountains of the east, including the Carpathian Mountains there in Romania and the Balkan Mountains further southeast in Europe there. So a pretty massive decline, a huge eradication really of lynx from many countries. But of course, it doesn't stay like that. Things begin to change, partly in response to the changes in the way that we use the landscape. And we had been chopping down forests to use the timber, to use the land for farming, as well as, of course, hunting the animals themselves. We were putting tremendous strain on wild deer populations. But as we get into the 20th century, the way we used the countryside started to change. We see rural depopulation. There was less pressure on the land. People are moving into cities. They're moving into other countries. And what we see are forests growing back, deer populations recovering, and things beginning to get better for lynx. But also, crucially, what happens is a change in human attitudes. By the time we get to the 1960s, people are starting to appreciate that we're having environmental impacts, and the discipline of ecology starts to get taught at universities. And we begin to think, well, maybe it wasn't the right thing to do to get rid of a predator, to make it extinct. Perhaps it had a function. And so people start talking about bringing them back. And we see a series of reintroduction projects, that is people taking wild lynx from further east in Europe, taking them into some of these quite densely populated parts of Western Europe and releasing them again, and effectively returning lynx to landscapes that only a matter of decades beforehand we were paying people to get rid of them from. So quite a dramatic turnaround. And this is what the modern map looks like today. not only do we see massive recolonization in the north, particularly in Scandinavia and in the east, thanks to legal protection, but we see these orange populations in the center of Europe there, reintroductions to, for example, the Swiss Alps, the Jura Mountains on the border between France and Switzerland, the Vosges and Palatinian areas on the French-German border, Bavaria, the Dinaric area of Slovenia, Croatia, and other places. So it's quite a transformation, and no longer are lynx being confined to the untrammeled wildernesses of Europe. They're now being found in some of the really quite busy human-modified landscapes of Western and Central Europe. And as Laurent's beautiful image, I think, shows very well, it's not an unoccupied wilderness they're living in anymore. This is a camera trap photograph taken in the Jura Mountains on the border between France and Switzerland. And this is a busy environment where there's 120 people per square kilometre on average. So it's 120. Just to put that into comparison, the area where I live, Highland, has 9 people per square kilometre, and it's a big area of very low population density. So lynx don't need wilderness. They can live cheek by jowl with humans, provided there's enough habitat, enough prey, and humans are prepared to live alongside them. Of course, living in a busy human environment means they're going to be interacting with some of the things that we like to use the landscape for. And of course, one of the things that I'm sure many of you are thinking about is livestock farming. And livestock farming is something that can give rise to conflicts, there's no doubt about it. Lynx can kill sheep, and they do kill sheep, but it's really important to understand exactly how that works, because it is by no means a uniform thing that happens right across Europe. What we can see here, of course, is a sheep flock. And a flock is an anti-predator behaviour. Basically, it's the animals clubbing together and using that combined increased number of noses, ears, and eyes to be on the lookout for predators. The other thing about flocks is they tend to be in open, grassy environments where there's not that much ambush cover. So a lynx is very reluctant to approach a flock of sheep because A, there's no ambush cover typically in an open pasture like this, and B, it means it's highly likely that they're going to get detected and the hunt is not going to be successful. Wolves, on the other hand, they won't see this lack of ambush cover as a problem, and they won't even see the flock as a problem either. But typically when you've got lynx and sheep living in landscapes where the sheep are in open pastures, you have very low levels of predation by lynx on sheep. It does happen, but it's pretty small scale and sporadic. The opposite, or one of the opposite ends of the spectrum, I suppose, in terms of this all-important relationship between livestock and sheep, is the situation that we see in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, where we've got traditional shepherding. They've basically never lost the ability to live alongside large carnivores. The shepherds have always had lynx and wolves and bears to think about. And so you have 24-hour shepherding. You've sometimes got corralling the sheep at night time to protect them. And you've got these things here, these livestock guarding dogs, which are big, powerful, pretty aggressive beasts. Now, one bear may well be able to fight off 3 or 4 of these things. A pack of 6 or 7 wolves might take on 3 or 4 of these things and outsmart them and outfight them. But one 20-kilo lynx is not going to take on a pack of 40-kilo dogs. And consequently, in Romania and Slovakia, we see very few, if any, losses of sheep to lynx. The other end of the spectrum is the situation in Norway, where we go from the Romanian situation of virtually no losses to Norway, where there's something like 6,000 to 10,000 sheep lost or being reported as lost every year. So a very different situation. And they have a compensation scheme in Norway, like many countries do, and they're paying out losses to farmers that equate to something like 3 million euros per year. So it's a lot of money. It's a pretty big issue. Now, it's worth saying that that is by far and away the worst case scenario in Europe by a long way. Just to put it into some context, right next door is Sweden. Sweden has the second worst case scenario in Europe. Now, there's a massive difference between the first and the second. So in Sweden, instead of paying out 3 million euros worth of compensation, they're paying out something like 37,000 euros. It's getting on for almost 1% of the problem. It's a much smaller issue, and they're only losing, roughly speaking, a couple of hundred sheep per year, as opposed to up to 10,000. So that is really quite significant and interesting, because in Sweden, they actually have 4 times as many lynx as they do in Norway. So they've got more lynx, but a much smaller issue. And remember, this is the second worst case scenario in Europe. So why is there this major difference between Norway and Sweden, and indeed Norway and the rest of Europe? Well, of course, the main reason is the way that they graze their sheep in Norway. In Norway, they're grazing roughly 2.5 million sheep in woodland, and that is the key thing. It's not an open pasture, it's in woodland, where the lynx live, where there's lots of ambush cover, and where there are relatively low deer densities. So from spring through to autumn, the lynx have got access to sheep, and the sheep are typically in woodland, not in flocks. They're single or they're in small groups, and they're replicating the behavior of roe deer, basically. Now, there's some interesting science done in this. A team of Norwegian scientists funded by the government looked into this relationship, and they pulled together years worth of data, and they came to a couple of really interesting observations. What they noticed was if you had relatively high deer densities, and by that they meant 4 roe deer per square kilometre, then even if you had a lot of sheep in the woodland, you just weren't losing sheep anymore. The lynx weren't really interested in the sheep, it's roe deer that they want. Now, 4 per square kilometre might be a lot by Norwegian standards, but that's a really modest number by our standards, where I would say it's more typical to have 10 or 15, perhaps even 20 woodland deer per square kilometre. We have a lot more deer in our woodlands. And actually, the vast majority of our woodlands don't contain any sheep. So that's a really important thing to bear in mind. So that's the relationship with deer, a key thing to remember. But what the other thing the boffins in Norway did is said, hang on, we've done the maths, we've done the number crunching, and we don't think lynx are capable of killing as many sheep as are being compensated for. Now, that's an interesting one, because you're thinking, hold on, these people are Scandinavian, they're going to be really well organized, they know what they're doing, they'll have a really good compensation scheme where you need really good evidence. Well, it transpires that for €3 million worth of compensation, in 97% of cases, there was no verification required. Now, in many places, many countries, you need a specialist, perhaps a vet or another trained person to come out, look at the type of attack, look at the bite marks, perhaps take DNA samples and get that analysed. And when it's confirmed it's a lynx, then you get a payment. But only in 3% of cases in Norway was that actually the case. And so the scientists were suggesting that perhaps other predators, and we have foxes, wolves, bears, wolverines, and golden eagles all tucking into sheep in these landscapes in Norway as well, they felt that the lynx was unfairly getting the blame. You could, if you're being less charitable, say, well, it's human nature. If there's a system that is abusable, then it will be abused. But their conclusion certainly was that in parts of Norway, the numbers of sheep that are getting killed by lynx is being exaggerated by up to 9 times. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there is an issue in Norway. Lynx can kill sheep, particularly in a woodland situation. So that is something that we definitely need to be borne in mind. But it's important to understand the Norwegian context, because it's the one that's increasingly being used by people who are opponents of lynx reintroduction. They're saying, hey, look, this is what lynx do with sheep. It could happen here. But we have to understand that this is not a uniform picture across Europe. It varies in both space and time. And of course, conflicts do arise, and not just about livestock. They can actually arise about other things. The number one conflict between lynx and people in Europe isn't actually about livestock at all. It's about deer. And if you think about it, if sheep is something that most lynx aren't actually touching, and in some countries and landscapes it isn't happening at all, then it isn't going to be a massive conflict everywhere. But of course, lynx are killing deer week in, week out. That's what they do. Every lynx is doing that. So there's much greater conflict around human hunters and lynx about competing for the same food resource, which of course is deer. What you can see here is a photograph from a veterinary pathology lab in Switzerland. And if you look closely, you might be able to see on that X-ray on the computer screen that that dead lynx that's been brought in for testing has got shotgun pellets in its abdomen. It's been illegally killed. Lynx are legally protected in Switzerland unless a license is given by the government to kill a problem lynx. And a problem lynx in Switzerland is one that has killed 15 sheep in a year. They haven't had to give a license for that since 2003 because lynx in Switzerland just aren't killing that many sheep. throughout the entire country in 1 year, you're typically looking at something in the order of 30 to 50 sheep being killed in Switzerland. And of course, they're grazing their sheep in open pastures rather than in woodland. So conflicts do arise. Conflicts are in fact found throughout Europe between humans and lynx. It doesn't matter how big the population of lynx is, whether they're strictly legally protected, whether you're allowed to hunt them, whether you've got a very good police force and judiciary, whether it's a very wealthy country or a poor country. That persecution of lynx illegally happens right across Europe. It's a fact of life or a fact of death for lynx in Europe. And even well-meaning people can be inadvertently deadly from a lynx's point of view. We live in a busy continent. There's 750 million people trying to get from A to B as fast as they can, whether it's on roads or whether it's on railway lines. And this Swiss lynx is about to try and cross a railway line. And of course, there are dangers there. The lynx might get to the edge of a 6-lane motorway and decide, you know, I'm not going to cross that. That is too scary. It's a psychological barrier. And so effectively what that road then does is fragment its habitat. It stops it being able to disperse and perhaps encourages inbreeding. The other thing, of course, is if a lynx does decide to cross that road or that railway line, it may well get killed in a collision. And in the busier parts of Europe, that is a significant cause of mortality. But, you know, it's not all bad news. It's not all threats. There are some opportunities here. You know, lynx are, as I've said before, a year-round predator of woodland deer. And that is a natural function of what it does. And, you know, if we don't have control of herbivore populations, they can sometimes get out of control and have ecological or economic impacts. And typically a lynx will kill something like a roe deer and it'll start feeding on the hind legs, as you can see here. It will cover up what it doesn't eat on the first day with some leaf litter or perhaps snow, sleep it off and then come back and keep on doing that for about 4 or 5 days until it's eaten most of what it wants. And of course, it's providing in the process it's providing food for a wide range of organisms, from beetles and maggots right up through golden eagles and bears. And of course, what they don't eat eventually gets broken down into the soil and feeds the earth, if you like. So a wide range of species, including these jays here that are scavenging in Switzerland of a lynx-killed carcass, will make use of them. But perhaps the #1 vertebrate scavenger of lynx-killed carcasses in Europe is this fella here, the red fox. They're particularly adept at sniffing out carcasses. They can find them despite the leaf litter and the snow covering them. But they've got a bit of a fine decision-making process to make here. They could sneak in while the lynx is sleeping off nearby, and there'll be perhaps quite a lot of meat because the lynx hasn't finished with it yet. But the danger, of course, is it gets detected. And if it is detected, the lynx will try and kill it. If it hangs back from the carcass and waits for the lynx to finish, then of course there may not be much left. It might just be skin and bones, which isn't going to be great. Better than nothing. But a difficult juggling act there for the fox. But we do know that lynx routinely kill foxes. We see this right across Europe. I have here the results of an intensive study of lynx diet that was done a number of years ago in Switzerland, over 10 years. It involved 29 different lynx being tracked around the landscape and scientists picking up the feeding remains. And as you'd expect, 90% of the over 600 animals that were collected were roe deer and chamois. Right at the bottom of the table, we've got 2 species we're really concerned about in Scotland, the wildcat and the capercaillie. Now, some people have said, hey, look, if we reintroduce lynx, they're going to compete with or kill wildcats who might compete for the same food. And of course, they could kill our capercaillie. And we're really worried about both of those species, and we don't want that to happen, surely. But of course, those 29 lynx in 10 years have between them killed 1 capercaillie and 1 wildcat. So I would argue that's very insignificant levels of predation. What's interesting is what's come third in the league table. 37 red foxes. Clearly, they're killing far more foxes than they are any other of these smaller carnivores. And of course, we know foxes and wildcats do compete for the same food, mice, voles, and rabbits, which lynx aren't terribly interested in. And of course, we also know fox are significant nest predators of capercaillie. So it could be that lynx predation might benefit some of the species we're already concerned about. And there is actually good scientific evidence from places like Sweden and Finland that as lynx move back into landscapes that they've been made extinct from by humans, there were some interesting changes in small game populations. So populations of capercaillie, of black grouse, of mountain hare actually rose when the lynx came back, which might seem a bit counterintuitive, but the scientists concluded that what was going on was that the lynx were suppressing foxes, partly through direct killing and partly through basically moving them on, scaring them out of the landscape. The foxes didn't want to be where the lynx were, and it seemed to benefit things further down the food chain. Occasionally, lynx might take a mountain hare, a black grouse, or a capercaillie, but it's not significant compared to the predation by foxes. So, I mean, much has been made about the potential for lynx tourism in this country, and there's no doubt about it. Large carnivore tourism is definitely a thing. You can go and pay a lot of money to go and stay in what is essentially a sweaty shed in the middle of a Finnish forest, where bait is put down to attract things like brown bears and also wolverines. You can go to some places in Europe, such as in parts of Italy and in parts of Spain, into a semi-open environment where people have got their mobile phones, walkie-talkies and telescopes, and you're looking for a wolf pack roaming around its home range on a daily basis. And you will see wolves out in the middle of the day in open landscapes, and you can spot them from these vantage points. However, neither of those methods works terribly well with lynx, it has to be said. Lynx don't really come readily to bait, and they're certainly not going to be, if they can help it, walking around in an open landscape waiting to be spotted by packs of humans with telescopes. That's not how it's done. So at first glance, it might seem that there's no real way of having a wildlife tourism initiative around this very shy, very elusive species. However, there's some really interesting examples from parts of Europe. This is from a national park in Germany on the border with the Czech Republic, and the branding of that national park for lynx is really quite impressive. There are signs to the National Park Visitor Centre with lynx logos on them. The vans driven by the National Park staff have got lynx emblazoned on the side. The visitor centre has this massive 10-metre high banner, and the shop inside the visitor centre is full of lynx merchandise, t-shirts and postcards and books and everything you can imagine. When I asked the staff behind the counter to give me some information about the National Park's lynx population, they kind of leant towards me over the counter and said, we don't actually have a lynx population here. And I said, pardon? And they said, well, you know, members of the public think they see them, but our rangers don't think we've actually got any, but it's really good at pulling in the tourists. And I was about to be shocked at the cynical attitude being adopted here until I remembered, well, I'm from the Scottish Highlands and we've got a Loch Ness Monster. Maybe I won't say too much about this, but it does show you can actually get benefits from having lynx, despite them being shy and elusive, or even, in some cases, non-existent. They have a really powerful ability to act as a branding icon. And we see this in several parts of Europe. In many people's minds, it's a wild and beautiful creature. And any landscape that supports them must therefore be wild and beautiful. And I think increasingly, that's what people want to experience. They know it's a very shy and elusive animal, and the chances of seeing it are very low. But you're not going to succeed if you just stay at home in the city. Let's go and visit the landscape. So what about Scotland then? I mean, if we're going to talk about reintroduction, of course, we need to know that we actually had them in the first place. And, well, we know that we did. Their bones have been found across the Scottish Highlands, and actually not just Scotland, right the way down to the south coast of England and also in Wales, right up to the north coast of Scotland. We know that we had lynx. Their bones have been found in limestone caves the length and breadth of the country. And we used to think they died out 4,000 years ago because of natural climate change, which would basically have meant that you can't really talk about reintroducing them if they died out naturally. However, we've now got more radiocarbon dates of the bone, and this particular specimen gave a date from 1800 years ago, and this is from the bone caves near Inchnadanf in Sutherland in the Northwest Highlands. More recent dates have been found from the Yorkshire Dales. We know that there were lynx living there in early medieval times. And when I was researching the book, I was thrilled to stumble across lots of pieces of cultural evidence, including a reference in 15th century Welsh poetry to an animal called the llawbrich, the speckled lion, which would follow the roe deer up into the hills in the summer months. And I thought, well, what else could that be? And of course, if they're living in North Wales in the 15th century, they're almost certainly living in the Scottish Highlands at the same time, and quite possibly into, say, the 16th century. So this animal was with us for much more recently than we used to think. But it still wasn't living here in the Scottish Highlands while at the same time as some of the other thinly populated mountainous areas, such as the Pyrenees and the Alps. So then the mid-green there in the map is from 1800. We didn't have lynx, it would seem. It seems that they've gone by then. So why have they died out in the Scottish Highlands but survived in other mountainous parts of Europe? Well, I think that comes down to the way that we use the landscape. And here in the British Isles, we deforested severely and we deforested early. We brought our woodland cover down to something like 4%. For an animal that's got big spatial requirements and these big landscapes that are pretty well wooded, full of wild deer, and of course our deer population succumbed as well. Roe deer got really scarce. This is an ecological disaster from a lynx's point of view. It can't survive with such little woodland, with so few deer, and get persecuted at the same time, probably because it's taken the odd sheep and goat as well. So you can see how they died out a bit earlier here than they might have done in other parts of Europe. And of course, if Scotland still looks like this today, then we can't really be talking about reintroduction if we don't have the habitat and we don't have the food. Well, Scotland is still a relatively treeless country. We have, about 18, 19% woodland cover, which is about half the EU average. However, there are some parts of Scotland that are pretty well wooded today. And from a lynx's point of view, it doesn't matter whether it's a misty Caledonian pine forest or whether it's a conifer plantation made up of trees from North America. The lynx doesn't care where the trees come from, as long as there's ambush cover and as long as there's deer in those landscapes to hunt. And we now know we've got lots of deer in this country. We've got our roe deer populations have recovered. Our red deer populations have recovered. We've also gained non-native species, fallow deer, and we've got sika deer as well. And again, the lynx doesn't care whether the deer are Japanese or not. It's protein, and that's the most important thing. And actually, these deer at high densities can cause problems, both ecologically and economically. Just to give you some idea, Forestry and Land Scotland, they manage 1/3 of Scotland's woodland cover. And they're shooting something like 38,000 woodland deer per year. And the net cost to Forestry and Land Scotland, a public agency, of deer impacts such as fencing and damage to trees and the need to pay people to shoot them runs to something like £5 million per year. And that's just 1/3 of Scotland's woodlands owned by them on behalf of the nation. There's still the 2/3. So we could be talking about, something like £15 million worth of deer management costs for woodland deer in Scotland. That's 38,000 being shot in just 1/3. By my calculation, looking at the available habitat and the amount of food that we've got in that habitat, we could support a very healthy lynx population these days. We've got 2 potential lynx habitat networks, a small one in the south of Scotland that actually straddles the border with England into Kielder Forest, and a much larger one that goes northwards, right across from Argyll over to Aberdeenshire, right up into Sutherland, where there actually are higher prey densities. And because it's got higher prey densities, it can support higher lynx densities. So you could support something, probably fewer than 100 lynx in the south of Scotland, but 400 lynx in that larger, well-connected population to the north. And if you've got a population of that size, then you're talking about 25,000 or so woodland deer being killed every year by the lynx population. Now, that's not going to replace the need to control woodland deer to protect our forestry and protect our ecology, but it could be a useful tool in the toolbox. It could be a 7-figure deer management service being provided for the sake of a 5-figure, if we remember Sweden, a 5-figure livestock compensation system. So in terms of conflicts then, what are the potential conflicts? I mentioned the deer conflict was the #1 in Europe, right across Europe. Well, I'm not so sure that it would be as significant in this country. Hunting of deer isn't the populous activity in the UK that it is in most other European countries. For example, in Norway, you're 60 times more likely to be a deer hunter than if you're in the UK. Very few people, comparatively to the rest of the population, are actually shooting deer, and yet we have an awful lot more deer. And the #1, I suppose, most culturally and economically significant deer species in Scotland is the red deer, particularly out in the open hill for the deer stalking, and particularly the stags. And of course, lynx don't really want to be out in open landscapes chasing herds of deer, particularly stags. That's not what they do. They're going to be in our woodland taking out well, sometimes red deer, but certainly roe deer, sika deer. Now, I'm not pretending that they don't have a cultural or an economic significance, those woodland deer. In some places, they certainly do. In many places, they're seen as a cost, something that needs to be controlled. But in general terms, I think the scope for conflict around deer is less. And equally, you know, driven grouse moors, we know there's a conflict about some predators there, but lynx are not going to be chasing birds around in an open, heathery landscape. That's not where they want to be. The issue about livestock, I think, is perhaps going to be more of a live issue for us here in the UK and in Scotland in particular. The UK, compared to the EU countries, has by far and away the largest sheep population. We have very many sheep, but most of them are grazed in open pasture, unlike the situation in Norway, where sheep, of course, are grazed in woodland, which doesn't mean to say there won't be issues. I think lynx will take sheep occasionally. You'll have the odd problem animal doing it now and then, but it will be small scale, it will be localized, and it will be manageable as it is in other European countries. Whether it's a compensation scheme, whether it's shooting problem animals, it can be fairly easily managed. Switzerland, like I said, they're losing something like 30 to 50 sheep per year to around about 200 lynx or so these days. So it's not a massive scale problem. So just to finish up then, I mean, I'm sure many of you, like myself, have got a camera trap, and maybe one day, if we put our camera traps up in a forest in Scotland, we might, like Laurent, get an image of a lynx. How likely is that to happen? Well, you know, anything's possible, but it's hard to see how a lynx reintroduction can be given the green light and how it can be successful if we're going to go and lob hand grenades from the trenches, as it were, via social media and pick fights with one another. However, if we're prepared to sit down and listen to people's views and have a respectful dialogue, perhaps meet people halfway, then maybe, just maybe, we can reach a mutually agreeable accommodation between the lynx and us. Thank you very much.
Hello, Dave, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Dave, thank you so much for that amazing insight into this wonderful animal. You know, really interesting to hear about some of the communities that celebrate lynx in their landscapes, but also not to shy away from conflict that might occur and look at mitigation of that conflict. We have a lot of questions, but I have to say you've answered many of them. Let me just bring up the Q&A again. There were a lot of people liked the questions about prey density and modelling. I think you covered that and you looked at where prey is and forest cover is in Scotland. So I think I'll leave that question. One of the questions was, if lynx were to be reintroduced to Scotland, what sort of population would be required for genetic diversity to allow that population to flourish?
No, that's a very good question, and I think it is important because obviously it's going to have to be a relatively small founder population. We can't just release 400 lynx. We need to start small, and you need to work up to that. And of course, being on an island, those animals are theoretically at least going to be isolated from there on in, although I dare say you can continue to manage the population. I think it's also really important to discuss where the lynx are coming from in terms of our source population. Certainly the modelling I did for my PhD suggested that ideally, to give yourself a really good chance without going overboard, because obviously there's cost implications from catching loads and loads of lynx, is it something in the order of 30 lynx would be needed. And ideally you want to make sure that they're not closely related. You want to make sure that they're not too old. You want to make sure that they're quite young and adaptable to new circumstances, being moved around. But also, like I say, the source population is important. It's tempting to just nip over to Norway because it's over the North Sea and get them from there. But we do know that lynx in the Scandinavian peninsula, so in Norway and Sweden, have gone through a genetic bottleneck and are much less well mixed genetically than, for example, in Finland and the Baltic nations like Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, where they've been replenished by a huge population in Russia. And we know that they're much genetically more mixed there. So I would definitely be getting lynx from somewhere a bit further afield, such as the northeast of Europe.
Okay, thank you. Another popular question was around what your thoughts are on if lynx were reintroduced, what impact they might have on natural native woodland.
Again, yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's unfortunately not a terribly easy one to answer. I'm sure many of us have seen the George Monbiot voiced YouTube video about how wolves change rivers, and I think that's been extrapolated to every river and every wolf pack, and for that matter, every carnivore. And I actually think it's a lot more complicated than that. The evidence from other parts of Europe is that that lynx can have a disproportionately heavier impact on deer populations when the deer populations are already quite low. If you've got a really high density deer population and you're just relying on lynx to sort that out, they won't make much of a dent in it. However, there's some really interesting science has been done in Switzerland that's shown that a combination of human hunting, lynx predation and harsh winters did dramatically reduce a high density deer population within a couple of years. Of course, the lynx ended up getting the blame by the deer hunters, and of course it wasn't as simple as that. There was, like I say, human hunting and winter weather was involved in that as well. But so in a high deer density population, you could start to bring about ecological effects, but I wouldn't be relying on lynx to do that single-handedly, unless of course you're talking about more modest deer densities, in which case it could do. And then of course there's the whole ecological aspect of the carcasses being provided for a wide range of species, and of course the carcasses also feed the soil and encourage vegetative growth as well.
Thank you, thank you. Another question, we've got time for a couple more questions. One question that came in was about what is the survival rate of a litter of lynx kittens?
Yeah, good question. I mean, you would typically, I think, expect to be losing half the kittens. I mean, they're prone to, well, disease, starvation, predators. They can actually squabble really violently as well. You do get sibling aggression, and it can lead to death. And then, like I say, once they get into the sub-adult stage, then again, you can be talking about really high mortalities as well, depending what sort of landscape and what sort of human pressures there might be in particular, because roads can be significant, human hunting can be significant. So yeah, I would say you're typically losing about half your lynx population by the time they get to adulthood, out of a litter, at least a half.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, could be a tricky one. The question is, how can lay people support the reintroduction of lynx, and perhaps more trickily, how close are we to doing this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Well, I mean, I think we're certainly a lot closer than we were 10 years ago, because of course 10 years ago nobody was really talking about lynx. The discussion about mammal reintroduction in the UK, and in particular in Scotland, was kind of dominated by the beaver, and it's taken us an awful long time to navigate our way through that particular discussion. We're really still in that discussion. And of course the wolf, we had been inspired by what the Americans had been doing in Yellowstone. There's a lot of public discussion about, oh, let's bring back the wolf to sort out the red deer problem. And of course it's only perceived as a problem by some people. And I'm kind of looking at this thinking, I'm not sure we're ready for wolves. I know they're popping up in some unexpected places in Europe today, but they are a very contentious animal. And yet nobody was talking about lynx. But clearly we're in a different place now, and people are talking about lynx. And I think lynx has overtaken the wolf as the large carnivore that people are, I suppose, most keen to see, or certainly that's closest to being discussed for reintroduction. And there's been a lot of NGO interest in doing that. And there was, of course, an application to do so in Kielder Forest in England, which got rejected a couple of years ago. So we're certainly getting closer, but this is not going to happen overnight. You know, this is not a straightforward thing. It's a complex socio-political issue. It's not really a biological issue. And in fact, most nature conservation isn't, of course. Most nature conservation is a political and sociological issue. So it's going to take some time to sort out. And I think, but what is key, going back to the first part of that question about what lay person can do, or lay people can do, I think the first thing they can do is make sure that they're well apprised of the facts, that they understand the animal, they understand the issues. And that's the key. And I've always felt that we need to understand the animal and the issue before we can really have a meaningful and progressive conversation about it.
Dave, thanks. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, of course, it's about lynx, but it's about people. It's about community as much as anything. Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Dave. If you would like to delve a little bit deeper into this fascinating creature, and I know we didn't get through all of the questions today. Most of them, I think all of them, I've read this many times, will be contained within this book. So please, we'll be sending you some details after the event today to show you how you can get hold of this book. And as I say, the images from Laurent are absolutely stunning. And if you would like to discover more about rewilding in Scotland, please join us on our next webinar. It's called Scotland, A Rewilding Journey. And it's with photographer and Scotland the Big Picture director, Peter Cairns. It's on August the 12th, but we'll be sending you details about that after today's event. I really hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Fantastic insight into this amazing animal from David. Thank you, David, again for your time today. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks.